Welcome to Pretty Lies and Alibis. Let's seek the truth and travel the long road to justice together. What you know, Alibis, welcome to another episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm Gigi. Good to have you here. It is Thursday, September 19th. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to hit subscribe, like the video, share it with your friends, ring that bell if you want notifications of when I post new content. Music fact of the day. Aside from being an amazing rapper and actor, Tupac enrolled in the Baltimore School for the Arts, where he studied acting, poetry, jazz, ballet, as well as other creative disciplines. Love Tupac. So what is Diddy facing as of right now? He's facing a minimum of 15 years in prison up to life, and that's just with the current charges. I expect a lot more charges to be piled on to what we currently have, but we'll see what happens in the future. I'm just going to rerun, by the way, this press conference from the day after he was arrested and this little slideshow of photos. Also, before we get started, just a trigger warning, and this is very disturbing allegations, so I just want to forewarn you if you are sensitive to these type of allegations, this may not be an episode you want to listen to. Just to recap, on Monday, Diddy was arrested in New York City, and then on Tuesday, he pleaded not guilty to those charges against him. Yesterday, on Wednesday, September 18th, there was a bond appeal hearing. Diddy's two sons, Christian and Justin, were in attendance. The U.S. District Attorney said they had concerns of Diddy intimidating witnesses, as well as causing obstruction of justice if he were to be let out on bond. And the DA said that witnesses have said they are afraid should Diddy get out. Now, the bond package offered by Diddy is $50 million in property. That includes his Miami mansion, which TMZ reported that the remaining $18 million that was owed on that mansion was paid off prior to his arrest. So he would be able to use that home as collateral in the event of his eventual arrest and when bond was visited. The other property offered was his mother's home. He also offered to wear an ankle monitor, stay in South Florida or New York City, and also, as a condition of his bond, he would not be around women except for family. He was denied bond, but let's get into both sides and what they argued yesterday. The USDA said the freak-offs began in 2009 and were still happening as of this year. They point out Diddy would use narcotics to keep the victims active. And also, he would use videos that were recorded during these freak-offs to kind of have in his pocket to be used as blackmail. They point to an email between a victim and Diddy where the victim says, "You are going to make me or leak things from the freak-offs." Another victim said that he was drugged and was threatened with a similar tape being exposed if he did not cooperate. They mentioned that they took possession of several guns that were in his residences that were found during the search warrants earlier this year, and point out some of the serial numbers were scratched off. There were weapons found in his closet, which he had easy access to. The DA said that Diddy's security agreed to monitor him if he's let out, but they also point out the head of Diddy's security has been sent a subpoena after they learned of his place in all of this. Now, I'll tell you, I really expect some people close to Diddy to maybe take a deal for immunity in exchange for their testimony. We'll see what happens, but I do think there are going to be other arrests sooner and not later in all of this. They also mentioned the assault that was caught on camera from a hotel and say that Diddy's defense calls it a relationship fight when, in fact, it's trafficking. At the time, there was a male sex worker in the room, and the victim seen on camera was trying to escape. Diddy is seen in a towel chasing her and then beating her. The male sex worker in this instance at one point sent a message to Diddy saying that he was still bruised and asked about retrieving his clothing. After the beating, Diddy sent messages to the victim saying that the cops were there, he's surrounded, he has 6 kids, and asked if the victim is going to abandon him and leave him alone. The USDA points out Diddy acknowledges in this message his actions could warrant the police coming to the hotel. The freak offs are the crux of the case where Diddy used force, coercion, and drugs to control his victims. They say the investigation is ongoing, and the dozen escorts they know about are a small fraction of those who were at the freak offs. Diddy is charged with sex trafficking by force, fraud, and coercion, and the sex acts were not done with consent. They say the defense says the participants were willingly at the freak offs, but when people are beaten and blackmailed, they cannot consent to those acts, and that constitutes trafficking. Mentioning victims also had their heads slammed against car windows, among other things. They bring in a text that was sent to Diddy from one of his victims where they say that Diddy would knock them around and mention that they themselves are someone's child and not a rag doll. They have people who saw these injuries to the victims and mention that this was done at various locations, such as cars, hotels, and Diddy's homes. At this point, the judge expresses concern that the defense will not be able to handle Diddy if he's released. The DA moves on with their obstruction argument, saying that after grand jury subpoenas were issued, Diddy contacted several witnesses and also went through a middleman to contact a victim who he hadn't spoken to in years. The call, by the way, was recorded on a third party's device. They give another example. In November of last year, Diddy reached out to a victim 14 times after subpoenas had been issued, but before prosecutors were able to conduct interviews. Also, in November of last year, Diddy called a victim twice. One text from a victim says as if they're reading their trauma and says the allegations laid out in the 3 pages they received are their experience. The state says Diddy called this female victim and tried to tell her this was consensual, and they also accused Diddy of gaslighting this victim. They allege that Diddy did some things along the lines of this person's rent not being paid. I'm going to tell you right now, his financials are being looked over with a fine-tooth comb, looking for any kind of payments to victims, things of that nature. Now, just a little backstory before we get into this next part. Dawn Richard, who was on Diddy's reality show Making the Band back in 2004, just recently filed a lawsuit against Diddy. She says Diddy promised to help her career if she gave in to his demands. She eventually was a part of the band Diddy Dirty Money. TMZ reported about this lawsuit on September 11th. And Richard said that Diddy terrorized, belittled, and sexually abused her. She also said she was a witness to beatings that Diddy inflicted on his ex-girlfriend Cassie, as well as his ex Kim Porter. She specifically names an incident where she saw Porter, who had visible injuries on her face, crying as she left a music studio. At that point, Richard said she realized her life may be in danger. She says she saw Diddy high on drugs, choke Cassie, throw her against a wall, drag her up the stairs at his home, throw a hot pan of eggs at her, put his hands around her throat, and punch her in the face. The DA says that after Richard filed her lawsuit accusing Diddy of sexual assault, he called Kalina Harper, who was a bandmate of Richard's, 54 times in one day, after Harper was named 33 times in the lawsuit as a witness to the abuse. In the lawsuit, she says that Harper initially tried to tell Cassie to leave Diddy. When Diddy found out the women were encouraging Cassie to leave him, he allegedly told the women that he can end careers to stay out of his relationship and that they could go missing, and said they want to die today. Richard says that Diddy forced her to rehearse for 48 hours straight with no rest. She says Diddy invited her to his home in Miami, and when she arrived, Diddy was only wearing underwear. So when she asked him to get dressed, he told her this was his effing house. She says the abuse worsened between 2009 and 2011. He would let himself into her dressing room when she was nude. This took place at his recording studio, and she says he touched her inappropriately. She gives another example in New York. Diddy locked her in a car for 2 hours with windows that were heavily tinted. She screamed and even called her dad for help. Her father later came to New York from Maryland and threatened to call the police on Diddy. In response, Diddy told Richard's father to think about his daughter's career. Now, Harper, who was named 33 times, just a reminder, posted on Instagram last Friday, September 13th, before the arrest, saying, I acknowledge the recent lawsuit filed by Dawn Richard in which my name has been mentioned 33 times. While I fully respect Dawn's right to recount her experiences, I want to emphasize that her account reflects her personal perspective and should not be interpreted as a universal truth applicable to everyone involved. It's important to understand that while I was present in some of the same professional settings mentioned, many of the allegations and incidents described in this suit are not representative of my experiences, and some do not align with my own truth. Tony and I have always conducted ourselves with the highest level of professionalism and integrity. We were not involved in, nor were aware of, any behavior that could be considered abusive or unlawful. As this matter is now part of an ongoing legal process, I will refrain from discussing any specific details further. My focus continues to be on my family, my music, and my work, which I will pursue with the same dedication and positivity that have always guided me. I trust that the legal system will handle this case with the fairness and thoroughness it requires, and I support any process that seeks to uncover the truth. The DA ends their argument saying that the bond package offered by Diddy does not have enough emphasis on the obstruction concerns, and also points out he's been using third parties to reach out to victims. Diddy's defense attorney, Mark Agnifilio, gets up and says, as far as the contact with Harper, he says he was called by her attorney and told them to do what they want as far as making a public statement about her being named in this lawsuit. Diddy's other attorney confirms that they did talk to her attorney on September 11th at 2 a.m. The judge asked the defense why would Diddy need to contact her further, and his attorney says because of her concerns that her name was in the news. His defense goes on to propose a bond package including 24/7 monitoring by 1 to 2 employees through a company called Sage Intelligence. It's a security firm whose employees are all former law enforcement from local to federal levels. I looked the company up, and their website says they are a private investigations and security consulting firm with offices in New York City and Miami. The defense said they would use a visitor log, and only those who were pre-approved would be allowed in to be around Diddy. They also said Diddy would not possess a cell phone or access the internet, which would eliminate the concerns of witness intimidation. His attorney said Diddy is respectful of the court's authority and he's a responsible person. They bring up when Diddy found out he was under investigation, he willingly gave his attorneys his passport, and also 5 family members did as well. He says they have a letter of intent for Diddy to sell his private plane. There were 3 potential buyers, but the sales didn't work out. In the meantime, he said he would park that private plane in California. The judge asked the defense to just sum it up and get down to the point. And so the defense mentions Epstein and Maxwell and say, unlike them, Diddy is trustworthy. He didn't tell authorities to come find him. The judge asked, how is this relevant to obstruction of justice and Diddy being dangerous? And why is he contacting witnesses back in April if he was aware of the grand jury subpoenas? And his defense says that Diddy was contacted by the woman and they advised him not to talk to her. They also point out in his 1999 New York case, Diddy showed up to every hearing on time. The judge asked if he were released, would Diddy have employees? His attorney said the ones who handle his finances, and they are located in California. When asked if Diddy would leave his home, they say no. The judge asked about the security firm that they proposed and if they would be allowed inside his homes. And the defense says yes, they would work in shifts and cameras would be in use 24/7. The judge brings up the video of the beating by the elevator and says it's troubling and mentions that when this incident occurred, Diddy is in his 40s. The defense says that Diddy came to the realization that he had anger and drug issues and went to rehab to address those issues. They also try to drag the victim into this, saying that the woman in the video also went to rehab at the same time he did. He says the victim and Diddy loved one another, and bringing in a third person for intimacy was a choice they made as a couple. The judge asked, how is this relevant to him punching her, throwing a vase at her, and what does this have to do with love? His attorney said it was jealousy that was fueled by cheating by both parties. The judge asked, what's your point? If you say they invited the third party into their relationship, but if that person is a commercial sex worker and crossed state lines, isn't that an issue? His attorney says after speaking with the agency the worker came from, they're not paid for sex. The judge asked about the video again and asked why isn't that relevant to his dangerousness. The attorney says it's not sex trafficking, and if you don't trust Diddy, then trust the bond package that they're proposing. $50 million in property, no phone, no internet, and that security company they proposed would be sure he's not a flight risk. His attorney says Diddy would be able to better prepare for trial if he's out on bond, and mentions that Diddy knew back in March that he was eventually likely going to be arrested and he didn't flee. Then the attorney just throws in that Diddy was an actual altar boy. And the judge is like, how far back into Diddy's past are we going? His attorney said Diddy watches sermons on a daily basis, and he's done a lot to earn the trust of the court and asked that Diddy be released. The judge says the USDA has proven to her that Diddy is dangerous and the bail package proposed by the defense is not sufficient. Bond was denied. They move on to talk about scheduling a status conference for the case. The USDA says their discovery will include photographs of evidence that was taken in the search warrants executed, including freak-off supplies. They also mentioned there is a lot of electronics in this case, and by the time of the status conference, they expect to have 35 full extractions to give to Diddy's attorneys. They asked the status conference be set for 90 days from now. His attorneys say at the moment they're not ready to waive his right to a speedy trial, and they asked for a status conference within 14 to 20 days. The judge said she could go ahead and set a date for trial, and if she isn't available, she can find a judge who is. The DA proposed an October 9th status conference date at 2 p.m. Diddy's defense says they'll know by then if he will waive his right to a speedy trial or not. The judge says they've gotten calls as recently as yesterday from people who claim to have evidence in this case and mentions they were referred to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Now, sources have come forward, and I'll put it out there because it was printed in mainstream media. I don't do rumor and speculation on the podcast, but I will quote when mainstream reports it. One source told the New York Times that Diddy was as bad as Epstein. He had rooms dedicated for these freak-offs. There were cameras recording from every angle, including angles you wouldn't even know about. Diddy was able to remotely view those cameras as well. The source goes on to say some of the victims were teenagers and, quote, these women are young, either barely legal or barely illegal, end quote. One source says the victims are clearly out of it while being victimized and that these victims were not free to leave. The source says, quote, these women are telling us things that we can independently verify with video evidence and physical evidence. These women have come forward and they're cooperating with us and says they are very brave. Now, Diddy was sent to MDC Brooklyn, a notoriously dangerous facility. He's in the special housing unit, or the SHU, as it's commonly called. His attorney said the conditions are inhumane there, and he's trying to have him moved to a different facility. After bond was denied, his attorney told the media that he plans to appeal the denial to the Second Circuit. When asked randomly what Diddy was eating, He said that he's heard the food in this facility isn't very good and Diddy is a healthy eater. He says Diddy was disappointed bond was denied, but says he's a tough guy in a real sense. He's resolved to defend himself and he is not broken. His attorney also said he would like to get Diddy to trial sooner than later in order to minimize the time Diddy is locked up. Now, his attorney did an interview with CNN's Caitlin Collins and said that Diddy was not surprised he was arrested. He said he told Diddy in early September, "You're going to be arrested soon," and told him to come to New York, which Diddy did. They offered Diddy to turn himself in, and he says he himself interviewed a large number of the men who were involved in these freak offs and says there's not the slightest hint that anything was not consensual or that any of the participants were too drunk or too high to consent. He says everyone who was there wanted to be there. And when asked if he's interviewed the woman who is the subject of these allegations, he says that she is a grand jury witness and they can't interview her. And when asked if he expects other women to come forward and say they were coerced into these freak offs, he says there's been a mountain of civil cases and he doesn't see these women as victims in the indictment. Now, tomorrow, we're going to dive into where Diddy is being held, what he can expect while he's incarcerated, as well as what's available to him through the commissary and the weekly menus, because you guys like that kind of stuff. What's it like behind bars? Clearly, Diddy, a target on his back due to who he is. And so he's being held in isolation, which I'm sure you've heard can break even the toughest of criminals. But we'll see if Diddy is going to waive his right to a speedy trial or if he's going to put the DA's feet to the fire and make them present this case sooner than later. It's going to be very interesting. Just one thing to clarify, a lot of people have asked, why wasn't this hearing streamed? With it being a federal case, for the most part, they don't stream these. Now, there are exceptions. We don't know if this trial, when it does happen, will be streamed. Kind of doubt it, but we will keep an eye on everything. So, tomorrow, we're going to dive into the jail he's at and those conditions. I'm going to take the weekend off. Saturday's my birthday. So I'm just going to take it easy and chill and probably veg on the couch all day. And then next week, we'll be back with some new stuff. But that's it for today. Hope you guys have a good rest of your evening, and we will see you soon.